Since I was asked to talk about the anti-colour bar campaign, the heartless treatment of the Windrush generation has come to light, and it seems appropriate to talk about matters past and present related to this despicable behaviour. My husband, George Powell, who died almost 5 years ago, came here from Jamaica in 1948. Before the Windrush, he came on a boat called the Orbiter, and he was actually returning here because he had spent 4 years here in the RAF, been demobbed in Jamaica early 1948, and very quickly decided to come back. Politically active from the word go, he campaigned against racial discrimination for the rest of his life. And in 1958, he published a pamphlet called Don't Blame the Blacks. And I've just discovered, thank you for stuff that came out of Ray Gosling's archives, but I discovered a paragraph from this pamphlet, which unfortunately I don't have a copy of. This paragraph: we must remember that colour prejudice, like anti-Semitism, is a weapon of class rule, and as such must find no support in the ranks of those whose task it is to establish a world that is free from want. It should be clear that to end race prejudice and the colour bar, which the ruling class use as their main weapon to divide the working class, the coloured and white workers must join in the common struggle against capitalism. So that's what he's saying in 1958. Now, you come to 1968, and Jamaicans who came to England before the 1968 Immigration Act was implemented, they were citizens of the United Kingdom and Commonwealth, as we were. And as such, they had, and still should have, the automatic right to remain here. This was about to be sabotaged by Enoch Powell's speech, the racist speech prior to the Immigration Act, which people remember him saying rivers of blood. I don't think that was in the speech, but that was the tenor of the speech, was where he was predicting what would happen if we continued to have unfettered immigration. But the Immigration Act had implications for the right to remain, and I'm sure you realise that after that, it was actually, I think, implemented in 1972 or 3. At that time, the right to remain here was no longer automatic. It had to be applied for, or in some cases reapplied for. If you'd got it in your old passport, you had to get it stamped in your new passport. And at that time, if you didn't have right to remain, it was free to get it. And also, if you could qualify for British citizenship, that was free as well. George became a British citizen as soon as he could, and he held Jamaican and British passports, United Kingdom passports, for the rest of his life. He tried to persuade his fellow Jamaicans of the advantages of going through those processes, but they didn't necessarily see the point. They had their Jamaican passports, they protected them, they were moving about here and there or whatever, and they didn't realise that this attitude might cause problems in future. And after all, many of them, had decided to come here for a couple of years, make some money, go back home. Some of them did, but many of them didn't, and those who stayed didn't see the point. Okay, you can have the vote. I don't vote in Jamaica, I don't care, whatever. And so if they didn't regulise their position in 1973, or keep records of their residence here, these omissions have come to haunt them now. Fortunately, the government in recent weeks have been persuaded to reverse some of its decisions and actions, although I doubt whether all the people concerned will be properly compensated. George helped thousands of Jamaicans in Nottingham not only to establish these rights of indefinite leave or become British citizens, but he helped get them visas for their relatives to come over here for weddings or funerals, a 3-month visa, family weddings, christenings, funerals. Those people had often had the experience of the people who were trying to come in from Jamaica, going to the commission in Jamaica, asking for visas, being met with stony-faced blank refusal, you cannot go to England. So the relatives here contact George, he talks to them, he tells them what information they need to send out an invitation to the person to come in, include bank statements, all the things that sugar the pill. And I believe, almost without exception, the people who came to him to get help with visas were successful. He helped people to send for their spouses and children to settle here, to gain places in college for their children, all manner of paperwork, including passports, driving licence, renewal, problems with debt or divorce, and all this work was completely voluntary, and he would never accept payment for it. If he were alive now, I know anybody in Nottingham who might actually or potentially be in this terrible situation would be around our kitchen table, and he would be helping them to try to get through the machinations, and he'd at least give them advice, if not representation. Having met George in the early 60s through CND and the Labour Party, I became involved in various struggles against what was then called the colour bar. George and I formed the anti-colour bar campaign. We never had a constitution or anything, we just called it. We said we are the colour bar campaign. Specifically to deal with the practice of a local pub, the Mechanics Arms, where black and white people had to drink in separate rooms. Can you believe this? Were we living under apartheid? At that time, if you were black, you probably had to pay more for an insurance premium. You'd often be turned away if you were seeking accommodation. If you went to a job interview, you turn up for the interview, the panel sees you, black, sorry, the job's gone. You could be verbally, physically abused in the street. Passers-by possibly would do nothing. You had little opportunity to meet with people in public places. Hence, the house parties, those overcrowded houses shaking with the music, amazing amount of alcohol, money, no, money was under the table, those house parties were the release for the black people of Nottingham. I found them horrible. Now, black people were working in our hospitals, our schools, factories, looking after our children, cleaning schools, maybe the streets. And while many of the host community welcomed them and befriended them from others, they got really short shrift. I was phoned one day by someone who found my number in a diary belonging to a Jamaican called Dennis. He was languishing in the police cell under the Guildhall, charged with attacking 3 white men in St Anne's. He was protesting his innocence. Did I know him? Could I help? I said, no, I don't know him. I think he must have been a contact through CND, and my number was in his diary. I spoke to Peter Price about this situation. Peter was an active socialist, a city councillor, and charismatic. And he was my landlord. We were able to see Dennis. I mean, Peter could go to the Guildhall and could get into the police cells, I couldn't have done that. We went talked with Dennis and got his side of the story, and shortly afterwards Dennis was out on bail with Peter for his surety. And there was also a character witness when it came to court. Witnesses for the 3 white men were incoherent and inconsistent, and their character witnesses were rather drunk and disorderly, as I remember. Not really, but they were not really believable. And the magistrates were not convinced that one slightly built black man could have jumped upon, assaulted and injured at the same time 3 well-built white men. On a lighter note, at that time, someone suggested that these were an Englishman, an Irishman and a Scotsman, but I think that was wishful thinking. And the white men were charged and convicted. OK, back to the Mechanics Arms. We set up this sit-in where the idea was to go and sit in the pub with half a pint of beer, everybody in groups of black and white, in the same room, and stay there, one drink all night, cutting the profits, and generally making the pub landlord and landlady uncomfortable. I think they knew we were coming. The place was crowded, and George couldn't have asked for a drink in that bar, so I ordered 2 drinks, one for him, one for me, and the landlady was just about to, money drink, and she saw George. The drinks got snatched back, so we didn't get our drinks. Somehow other people did get drinks, but as you can imagine, those who did were only allowed to have half a pint. They were disgruntled, we were disgruntled, everybody was disgruntled, and tempers rose. And somehow or another, a Nigerian called Steve tipped over his drink onto the bar, and the police were called. They spoke with the landlady and with Steve, and then we all left. When the matter came to court, I was one of the witnesses giving to evidence of the racially discriminatory remarks and behaviour. And both these people, the landlady and Steve, because the landlady had said something rude to him, that's why he chucked the beer over, they were both bound over to keep the peace. A short while after, the peaceful George Powell visited the pub to see if diplomacy would do any good, and he found the landlady was actually terrified of black people because a Jamaican had, at one occasion, thrown a stool over a bar and there was lots of glass. She was literally terrified. So he tried to get them to see that racial discrimination was wrong, and don't think that black man represents the whole population, but nothing. The landlady eventually successfully appealed against her order of breaching the peace, but the pub had been closed down, and we were told it was reorganisation from the brewery, but the timing was a bit... We like to think that we had some sort of effect on it. Now, I didn't have any records of this campaign when I was asked to speak here, but some have been found. One was an agenda for the anti-colour bar campaign meeting on May the 22nd, 1968, which suggests that somebody was carrying on the campaign, but to be honest, I have no recollection of it. We did nothing about it anymore, and we were fighting discrimination, but not through the campaign. The other thing was that there was a flyer discovered advertising a Caribbean dance in the Elizabethan rooms at the old co-op to raise funds for the Sugarcane Club, and this was on Friday, May the 3rd. There was no year on that poster, but May the 3rd was the right day of the week, Friday. The Sugarcane Club was a name coined by George and a couple of other people because they wanted to set up something in Nottingham, somewhere where black people could mix out with white people as well, but could go and socialise. Sugarcane Club, anti-colour bar campaign, it's all archaic, isn't it? But that name was soon dropped, but the concept was actually realised 10 years later, in 1978, when the Afro-Caribbean National Artistic Centre, George insisted on national artistic, was established on Hunger Hill Road at St Anne's. Now, he was often involved in other organisations and campaigns that were wider political things, national, sometimes international. He was elected as a district councillor in Long Eaton, probably the first black person in such a position in this country, and later became a county councillor in Nottingham. His lasting legacy was, apart from being the go-to man when fellow Jamaicans needed help, was the setting up of the Afro-Caribbean Centre, where he was company secretary for over 3 decades. But that's another story.